The night my daughter-in-law threw my dinner plate onto the restaurant floor and called me a witch, I realized something important about my family that I had been refusing to see for years. The sound of porcelain sliding across polished tile wasn't loud, but it carried through the quiet dining room like a dropped coin in a cathedral. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Even the waiter beside our table froze with a glass of iced tea in his hand. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where my plate had been only seconds before. The steakhouse was one of those upscale places in downtown Chicago where the lighting is low, the booths are leather, and every table has a small candle glowing in the center. Daniel had insisted we meet there to celebrate his promotion. My son had always liked places that felt important. Places where everyone dressed well and spoke quietly. Places where people noticed you. Ashley stood across the table from me, her hands still trembling slightly from the sudden motion that had sent my dinner sliding away. Her face was tight, flushed, the way it gets when someone has already decided they're right and doesn't care who hears it. Which, she said again under her breath, as if repeating the word made it more justified. You should have never come. Around us, I could feel people pretending not to stare. A couple near the window looked down quickly at their menus. Someone at the bar cleared their throat. In the silence that followed, the candlelight flickered across Daniel's face. My son didn't look at me. He didn't look at Ashley either. Instead, he studied the tablecloth like there was something fascinating about the stitching. That was the moment that hurt the most. Not the plate, not the word, the silence. For 72 years I had lived in this country, raised my son, buried my husband, paid my taxes, and kept my promises. I had learned that people reveal who they really are in small moments, not big speeches. And Daniel's silence said everything. I folded my napkin slowly and set it beside my empty place setting. My hands were steady, which surprised even me. The steakhouse smelled faintly of grilled meat and butter. Somewhere behind me, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. Life in the restaurant continued, careful and quiet, like everyone had agreed not to interfere with whatever this strange scene at table 12 had become. Margaret, Ashley said sharply, as if my calm irritated her more than anything else. Did you hear me? Of course I had heard her. The whole room had heard her. I looked up at her then. For a brief second, our eyes met across the candlelight. I noticed details that had escaped me before. The impatience in her posture, the way her fingers tapped against the table, the tight smile she always wore when she thought she was winning something. Then I turned to my son. Daniel, I said gently. My voice sounded older than usual, but it was still steady. Is that how you feel too? He shifted in his chair. His tie was slightly crooked, something I would have fixed automatically years ago before he walked out the door for work. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly and looked away again. That was answer enough. I nodded once, more to myself than to anyone else, and stood up from the table. My chair slid back quietly across the carpet. No shouting, no scene, just a woman leaving a restaurant where she suddenly understood she had never really been welcome. I stepped out of the restaurant into the cool Chicago night, and the air felt different, sharper somehow, as if the city itself had decided to wake me up. Michigan Avenue was still busy at that hour, headlights sliding past in long silver lines while people hurried along the sidewalk with shopping bags and winter coats pulled close around their shoulders. For a moment, I simply stood there beneath the soft glow of the restaurant sign, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the quiet hum of the city that never truly sleeps. Inside the restaurant, someone opened the door and a burst of warm air and polite conversation spilled out behind me before the door closed again and the noise disappeared. It was strange how quickly life continued once you stepped away from the center of a moment. I walked slowly toward the parking garage a block away, my heels clicking against the pavement in a steady rhythm. 72 years is a long time to live in one place, long enough to recognize how a city changes over the decades. When Daniel was a little boy, I used to bring him downtown every December to see the Christmas lights along State Street. He would hold my hand and look up at the tall buildings like they were mountains. Back then he believed I could fix anything. A scraped knee, a broken toy, even a bad dream in the middle of the night. Somewhere along the way that changed. I reached my car and unlocked the door, then sat inside without starting the engine. The steering wheel felt cool beneath my hands. From where I was parked, I could see the top of the restaurant sign glowing above the corner of the building. A few minutes passed before I realized I was replaying the evening in my head. Not the moment with the plate, but everything that came before it. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier. Daniel had called and said he wanted to celebrate his promotion. His voice had sounded rushed, the way it always did lately. But there was something else too, something careful about the way he spoke, as if he had practiced the conversation before dialing my number. Ashley had not spoken during the call, but I could hear her faintly in the background, giving suggestions about the reservation time and the restaurant. At the time, I told myself that families change when children grow up and marry. That was the reasonable explanation. Sitting alone in my car that night, however, another thought slowly settled into place. The dinner had not been an invitation at all. It had been an opportunity for Ashley to say something she had probably wanted to say for a very long time. The realization did not make me angry the way someone might expect. Instead, it made everything feel suddenly clear. For years, I had convinced myself that the distance between my son and me was temporary, something that would pass once life slowed down. Yet the truth was simpler. Some people build new lives and quietly remove the pieces that no longer fit. I looked at the dark windshield and saw my own reflection faintly staring back at me. My hair had turned almost completely silver in the last decade, but my eyes were still steady. I took a slow breath and reached for the ignition key. The engine started with a soft hum. As I pulled out of the garage and turned onto the wide avenue, the city lights stretched ahead of me like a road leading somewhere unfamiliar. For the first time that evening, I realized something important. Ashley had believed she was ending something at that dinner table. She did not understand that she had only begun it. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes because traffic along Lakeshore Drive was thick that night, but I did not mind the delay. The steady motion of the car and the quiet sound of the radio helped clear my thoughts. The city skyline stretched beside the lake, every building window glowing like small squares of light against the dark sky. I had seen that view thousands of times over the years, yet that evening it felt unfamiliar, as if I were noticing details that had always been there, but had never truly registered before. When I finally reached my neighborhood on the north side of Chicago, the streets were calmer. The houses stood close together with small front yards and old oak trees lining the sidewalks. My home sat halfway down the block, the same brick house Daniel grew up in, the same place my husband Thomas and I had bought almost 40 years earlier when mortgage rates were much higher than they are now. I parked in the driveway and turned off the engine, but I remained seated for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Through the living room window, I could see the lamp beside my favorite armchair still glowing. I had left it on before driving downtown, a small habit that made the house feel welcoming when I returned at night. The quiet inside the car felt peaceful compared to the tense silence of the restaurant earlier. I stepped out, locked the door, and walked slowly toward the front porch. The wooden steps creaked the same way they always had, a familiar sound that reminded me of evenings long ago when Daniel would run up them 2 at a time after school. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the lavender candle I often lit in the evenings. I hung my coat on the rack near the door and walked into the living room where the soft lamp light filled the space with a warm glow. Photographs lined the shelves along the wall. There was one of Daniel at 8 years old holding a baseball glove that looked far too big for his hands. Another showed Thomas and me standing beside a small fishing boat on Lake Michigan during a summer vacation many years ago. I had always believed that memories inside a home could anchor a family together, like quiet reminders of where everyone came from. Yet as I stood there looking at those photographs, another realization slowly formed in my mind. Ashley had never liked this house. She had once called it old-fashioned during a holiday dinner, though she had said it politely with a smile that almost sounded like a compliment. At the time, I thought it was simply a difference in taste between generations. Now I wondered if it had meant something else entirely. I sat down in my armchair and folded my hands in my lap. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Somewhere in the back of the house, the refrigerator motor started with a gentle hum. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary home. But my thoughts returned to Daniel again, to the way he had avoided my eyes across that restaurant table. A son does not look away from his mother like that unless he has already made a decision. The more I considered it, the clearer the pattern became. Over the past year, Daniel had begun asking subtle questions about the house, about the property taxes, about whether maintaining a place with 3 bedrooms was difficult for someone my age. At the time, I answered casually, believing he was simply concerned about my comfort. Sitting there in the quiet living room that night, however, a different explanation began to emerge. Perhaps the dinner had never been about celebrating his promotion at all. Perhaps it had been meant to test how easily I could be pushed aside. The house felt unusually still that night, the kind of quiet that gives a person time to notice things that usually go ignored. I remained in the armchair for a long time, watching the soft light from the lamp fall across the photographs on the shelf. Each one held a small piece of a life I had spent decades building. When Daniel was 6 years old, he insisted on wearing his baseball cap to bed because he believed professional players did the same thing before an important game. When he was 12, he built a small wooden birdhouse in the garage with his father and painted it bright blue even though the paint dripped along the edges. Those memories had always felt permanent to me, like bricks in the foundation of a house that could never shift. Yet families change in ways that are often so gradual you do not see the movement until much later. The first time I sensed the difference was 3 years ago at Thanksgiving dinner. Ashley had just finished arranging the table, and she stood in the doorway studying the dining room with a thoughtful expression. Then she said something that seemed harmless at the time. She said that the house had good bones, but that it would probably sell for a strong price if it were renovated and listed in the current market. Daniel laughed and told her she sounded like a real estate agent. I remember smiling politely and pouring more gravy into the serving bowl. Back then I believed it was simply conversation. Over the next year the topic returned more than once. Daniel asked whether the stairs were difficult for me. Ashley wondered if a smaller condominium closer to downtown might be more convenient for someone my age. Their voices were always careful, always framed as concern, yet there was a certain eagerness behind the questions that I did not fully understand until that evening in the restaurant. As I sat in the quiet living room, I realized how often those conversations had appeared during the past 12 months. Little remarks during holiday dinners, casual comments about property values, questions about whether I had ever thought about moving somewhere warmer during the winter. Each one by itself seemed harmless. Together they formed a pattern that now looked impossible to ignore. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. The hardwood floor beneath my feet had been refinished only twice since Thomas and I bought the house decades earlier. We used to joke that the floor had witnessed every stage of Daniel growing up, from the tiny footsteps of a toddler learning to walk to the heavier stride of a teenager rushing out the door to meet his friends. I poured myself a glass of water at the kitchen sink and looked out the window toward the backyard. The old maple tree stood exactly where Thomas planted it 35 years ago. In autumn its leaves still turned the same deep shade of red that Daniel loved as a child. For most of my life, I believed a home was simply a place where a family lived. That night, I understood something different. A home is also something people begin to calculate the value of once they stop seeing the person who lives inside it. I set the glass down carefully on the counter and allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. Ashley believed the dinner downtown had been a moment of victory. She believed she had finally said what she had wanted to say for a long time. What she did not realize was that sometimes the quietest person in the room is also the one who sees the most clearly. I washed the glass and placed it carefully on the drying rack beside the sink, then turned off the kitchen light before walking back toward the living room. The clock on the wall showed a little after 10:30. Chicago nights always feel different once the traffic slows down and the neighborhood settles into silence. I sat again in my armchair and reached for the small wooden box on the table beside it. Inside were a few things that Thomas had kept organized for years, documents he always said were important even though he never liked discussing finances in great detail. My husband had believed that some responsibilities should be handled quietly so the rest of the family could live without worry. After he passed away 2 years earlier, I had looked through the box only once, mostly to make sure everything was still there. I had not thought about it again until that evening. I opened the lid and lifted the neat stack of folders tied together with a thin blue ribbon. The papers were crisp and carefully labeled in Thomas' handwriting, the same steady script he used when signing birthday cards or writing notes on the refrigerator calendar. One folder contained insurance documents. Another held old tax statements. Beneath them rested a thicker envelope marked simply with our last name and the year it had been prepared. I placed it on the table and sat back, considering the quiet weight of that envelope in my hands. Thomas had always believed in planning ahead. When Daniel graduated from college many years ago, Thomas told him something that sounded almost like a lesson. He said that people should always understand the difference between what they earn and what they assume they deserve. Daniel laughed at the time, thinking his father was being philosophical in the way older men sometimes are. Yet Thomas rarely spoke without purpose. I untied the ribbon slowly and opened the envelope. Inside were several documents prepared by a law office downtown. The name of the firm looked familiar. I remembered meeting the attorney once during a meeting Thomas scheduled many years earlier, though at the time I did not pay much attention to the details because Thomas handled those matters himself. The papers described arrangements connected to our home, our savings, and several small investments Thomas had managed quietly over the years. Reading through them carefully, I realized something that made me sit a little straighter in the chair. The ownership of the house had never changed after Thomas died. That was expected, but the documents also explained something else. Decisions about the property could not be made by anyone except the person listed as the sole trustee. I turned the page slowly and read the name printed in clear type at the bottom of the document. It was my name. For a long moment, I simply sat there, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock and the distant sound of a car passing along the street outside. Ashley and Daniel had spent the last year asking questions about this house, as if it were a simple asset waiting to be transferred to the next generation. What they did not understand was that Thomas had never been careless about the things he built for his family. I placed the documents back into the envelope and closed the lid of the wooden box with a soft click. The realization did not make me angry. Instead, it brought a calm clarity that had been missing earlier in the evening. Ashley believed she had forced me into a corner at that restaurant table. Daniel probably believed the same thing when he looked away instead of answering my question. Yet sometimes the quietest moment is simply the beginning of a much longer conversation, and that conversation had not truly started yet. The next morning the sunlight came through the kitchen window in long pale lines across the table, the same way it had for decades. Chicago mornings always arrive quietly in my neighborhood. A delivery truck passed slowly down the street, and somewhere a dog barked once before everything settled again. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table beside the window where Thomas and I used to read the newspaper together. The wooden box still rested on the counter where I had placed it the night before. For many years I believed that certain documents were simply formalities, things that existed quietly in the background of life without ever needing to be used. Now I understood that Thomas had prepared those papers with much more intention than I realized at the time. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard. The maple tree moved slightly in the morning breeze, and a few early autumn leaves drifted across the grass. The house felt peaceful in a way that made my thoughts clearer. Ashley had believed that dinner downtown was the moment when she finally pushed me out of the picture. Her voice had carried confidence, the kind that comes from assuming the outcome has already been decided. Daniel had remained silent beside her, and that silence said more than any argument ever could. Yet the documents in the wooden box told a different story, one that neither of them seemed to understand. After finishing my coffee, I stood up and carried the box to the dining room table where the light was brighter. I opened the envelope again and read through the pages more carefully than I had the night before. The language was precise and calm, written in the careful tone attorneys use when they want every word to matter. The structure Thomas created was simple in one sense and very deliberate in another. The house remained protected under a trust arrangement that required the trustee to approve any decision involving ownership, sale, or transfer. Without that approval, nothing could move forward. The trustee, as the document clearly stated, was me. I read that sentence twice, just to be certain I had not misunderstood it. For a long moment, I simply sat there listening to the quiet ticking of the clock in the hallway. Thomas had always believed that patience revealed more about a situation than anger ever could. That thought stayed with me as I carefully returned the papers to the envelope. Daniel and Ashley would probably wake up that morning believing the events of the previous night had settled something important. They would assume the silence at the restaurant meant the final word had been spoken. What they did not know was that the real conversation about this house had never happened at that table. It had started many years earlier when Thomas chose to prepare these documents. I closed the envelope and tied the ribbon neatly around the folders again before placing the box back on the counter. The morning sunlight had grown stronger now, filling the room with a calm brightness that made everything feel steady. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, I felt completely certain about the next step. Not because I was angry, but because clarity has a way of replacing confusion once you finally see the full picture. I walked toward the phone on the kitchen wall and looked at the number written on a small card beside it. The contact information for the law office Thomas had trusted for so many years. Then I reached for the receiver. I held the receiver in my hand for a moment before dialing the number. The small card beside the phone had been there for years, tucked neatly under the edge of the corkboard where Thomas used to pin reminders and grocery lists. The law office was located downtown, only a few miles from the restaurant where everything had unfolded the night before. I had visited the office only once, nearly a decade earlier, during a quiet meeting Thomas scheduled on a rainy afternoon. At the time, I assumed it was simply part of the careful way he handled our finances. I dialed the number slowly, listening to each tone as it echoed softly through the kitchen. After 2 rings, a calm voice answered the call. The receptionist introduced herself politely and asked how she could help. I explained my name and mentioned that my late husband had worked with their firm for many years. There was a brief pause as she searched their records, followed by a change in her tone that carried a note of recognition. She said the firm still maintained the file connected to our family trust and asked if I would like to schedule a consultation with the attorney who now handled those matters. I agreed, and within a few minutes, we arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. After hanging up the phone, I stood quietly in the kitchen, looking out toward the backyard again. The maple tree moved gently in the breeze, its leaves catching the morning sunlight in soft flashes of red and gold. The calmness of the house felt steady, almost reassuring, like the quiet confidence of a place that had seen many years pass without needing to prove its value. Later that day, I drove downtown to confirm the appointment time and familiarize myself with the building where the law office was located. The firm occupied the 7th floor of a tall stone building that had stood in Chicago for nearly a century. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where business was conducted carefully and without unnecessary noise. The receptionist greeted me with the same calm professionalism I remembered from years earlier, and assured me that the attorney would be ready to review the trust documents during our meeting the next afternoon. As I stepped back outside onto the busy sidewalk, the city moved around me with its usual rhythm. People crossed the street carrying briefcases and coffee cups while taxis rolled slowly along the curb. For the first time since the dinner the previous night, I felt something that was not confusion or disappointment. It was a quiet certainty that the situation was not as simple as Ashley believed it to be. That evening, back at home, I placed the wooden box once again on the dining room table and reviewed the documents with careful attention. The language confirmed exactly what the envelope suggested. The trust structure placed the authority for any decision involving the property firmly in the hands of the trustee. My name appeared there clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Daniel and Ashley might believe the house was an asset waiting to pass naturally into their lives, but Thomas had built protections around it that were designed to prevent assumptions from turning into decisions. I closed the folder and looked around the quiet room, noticing once again the photographs along the shelves and the familiar furniture that had filled the house for decades. Families sometimes believe they understand the future simply because they recognize the past. Yet the future often unfolds in ways that surprise those who believe they have already written the ending. Tomorrow afternoon, I would sit across a polished desk from an attorney who understood exactly how these documents worked. And once that conversation began, the quiet assumptions surrounding this house would finally meet the clarity they had been missing. The following afternoon, the sky above Chicago was pale and clear, the kind of calm autumn day that makes the city feel almost orderly despite the constant movement of traffic and people. I arrived at the law office a few minutes early and took the elevator to the 7th floor, listening to the quiet hum of the cables as the numbers lit up one by one above the door. When the elevator opened, the hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, the same quiet atmosphere I remembered from years earlier. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to take a seat in a small waiting area beside a wide window that looked out over the downtown streets. From that height, the cars below appeared smaller and slower, moving along the grid of avenues like careful lines on a map. After only a few minutes, a man in a dark suit stepped into the reception area and introduced himself as Mr. Harold Whitaker, the attorney now responsible for overseeing the trust documents Thomas had prepared years earlier. His voice was calm and measured, the kind of voice that suggests a person is accustomed to dealing with complicated matters without raising the volume of the conversation. He invited me into his office where a large wooden desk stood beside shelves filled with thick legal volumes and neatly arranged folders. I placed the envelope from the wooden box on the desk and explained that I wanted to understand the exact authority the documents provided. Mr. Whitaker opened the folder carefully and began reviewing the pages with the steady attention of someone who had spent decades studying the language of contracts and agreements. After a few minutes, he looked up and folded his hands together thoughtfully. He explained that Thomas had created a family trust structure designed specifically to prevent misunderstandings about ownership of the property. According to the terms written in the documents, the house and several related financial assets remained protected inside that trust and could not be transferred, sold, or modified without the approval of the trustee. He paused briefly before continuing, as if making certain I fully understood the next point. The trustee named in the documents was me. That meant every decision involving the property would require my direct authorization. No one else could legally move forward with any plan regarding the house unless I approved it first. The explanation was delivered in a calm and professional tone, yet the meaning was perfectly clear. I asked a few careful questions about how those rules worked in practical terms, and Mr. Whitaker answered each one with patient precision. The trust arrangement was not unusual, he explained. Many families used similar structures to ensure that property remained secure until the proper moment arrived for it to change hands. Thomas had simply been very thorough when he prepared the documents. When the meeting concluded, Mr. Whitaker returned the envelope to me and said something that stayed in my mind as I stood to leave. He said that the strength of a well-written agreement is not measured by how often it is used, but by how clearly it defines the boundaries of a situation. Outside the office window, the city continued its steady movement while I gathered the papers and placed them carefully back inside the envelope. As I stepped into the hallway and pressed the elevator button, I felt the same calm certainty that had begun the night before when I first opened the wooden box. Ashley believed the dinner had settled the matter of my place in the family. Daniel probably believed the same thing when he chose silence instead of answering my question. Yet the quiet pages inside that envelope told a very different story, one that had been written years earlier by a man who understood exactly how easily assumptions can become mistakes. I stepped out of the elevator and into the afternoon light of downtown Chicago with the envelope held carefully in my hand. The air carried that crisp autumn clarity that always arrives in the city once summer finally loosens its grip. People moved along the sidewalks with quiet purpose, briefcases in hand, coffee cups balanced carefully as they crossed the busy intersections. For a moment, I stood there beside the stone entrance of the building and watched the movement of the city around me. The noise of traffic and distant conversations blended together in the familiar rhythm of urban life. It reminded me that the world continues forward regardless of the private moments that change a person's understanding of their own life. I walked slowly toward my car, thinking about everything Mr. Whitaker had explained during our meeting. The documents Thomas prepared years earlier had not been complicated once their purpose became clear. They were designed to protect the home, not simply as property, but as something that could not be casually taken or transferred because someone believed they deserved it. That detail changed the entire meaning of the conversation Ashley thought she had finished in that restaurant. When I reached the car, I placed the envelope gently on the passenger seat before starting the engine. The drive back through the city felt calmer than any moment since the dinner 2 nights earlier. The tall buildings gradually gave way to quieter neighborhoods where trees lined the streets and small houses stood behind neat lawns. By the time I turned into my driveway, the afternoon sun had begun to lower slightly, casting long shadows across the yard. The maple tree in the backyard moved softly in the breeze, as if nothing in the world had changed. Yet something had changed, just not in the way Ashley expected. Inside the house, the familiar quiet greeted me again. I placed the envelope on the dining room table and looked around the room that had witnessed decades of family dinners, birthdays, and ordinary evenings that once felt permanent. For many years, I believed keeping peace in a family meant avoiding certain conversations. I believed patience and silence were always the best ways to prevent conflict. The dinner downtown had shown me something different. Silence can sometimes allow people to assume they already know the outcome of a situation. I walked to the living room window and looked out toward the quiet street where the late afternoon sunlight touched the tops of the trees. Daniel would probably call eventually. Ashley might try to explain what happened in the restaurant, or perhaps pretend the moment meant less than it clearly did. Yet now the situation had boundaries neither of them fully understood. Thomas had drawn those boundaries years earlier with the careful precision of a man who believed responsibility should always be protected by preparation. I picked up the envelope again and ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the papers inside. The future of this house was not a question that could be decided by a moment of anger in a crowded restaurant. It was something that would unfold according to decisions made with patience and clarity. For the first time since that evening, I allowed myself a quiet smile. Ashley believed she had pushed me out of the picture. Daniel believed the silence at that table meant the story had already ended. What neither of them realized was that the story had only just begun.